In the quiet corners of history, there are stories not often told. Stories shaped by human strength and human failure. This is one of those stories. The accounts we share now reach back through time to reveal moments that changed the world. Let us begin by traveling into a past long forgotten, yet still echoing into our present. After the Titanic slipped beneath, the world woke up to headlines full of comfort but empty of truth. Newspapers told everyone the ship was safe and all souls were saved. But far out in the cold Atlantic, the Carpathia was racing through silent seas, heard waiting for survivors. So how did those happy reports spread, while the true story was still forming on that dark ocean? The first signals flew out as broken code CQD, then SOS. They reached ships with radios left and attended in shore stations, catching pieces through the storm static. Messages jumped from one relay to the next, changing with each handoff. Some operators heard a ship and hit ice, others copied wrong positions. Across the Atlantic they wrote down what they could, then lost the signal, then heard it again. No one could fit the pieces together. By morning the pictures showed a ship in trouble somewhere up north, but not a disaster. Hours later the public saw headlines going every direction. Early papers spoke of tow lines and a damaged hull under control. Afternoon sheets ran a safer story, all passengers transferred, no lives at risk. Evening presses changed the report, talking of lifeboats and calls for help. Some papers printed bold banners saying all were saved, while smaller text below whispered doubt. Editors used careful words to fill the gaps. Typesetters locked the pages, then tore them open when new cables arrived. Facts shifted by the minute. The technology of the time could not keep up. Wireless sets from 1912 drifted in frequency and relied on the human ear. Spring storms masked weak signals. No rule made ships keep a radio watch all night, so many sets were silent when the calls went out. Messages that reached shore faced another delay. Telegraph lines were jammed with everyday business. Clerks read hurried copies and made mistakes with names and numbers for the press. In newsrooms desks piled high with paper slips. City editors sent runners to cable officers and shipping agents. Night editors argued whether to stop the press, change a headline, or wait for the next update. Telephones rang without pause as reporters called every shipping firm and consulate in town. The confusion grew because the same cable office might send out a hopeful note and a grim one depending on which message arrived first. Outside, the shock rolled through London, New York and Belfast. Commuters saw chaos with competing posters on the same sheet. In Belfast, shipyard workers paused for news about a ship their hands had built. New York's financial district watched stock tickers jam and stutter with news about an ocean liner and insurance shares. London's papers printed extra editions. Crowds gathered to read, then argue, then wait all over again. Through the noise, one clear signal broke through from the north. A young wireless operator in Newfoundland heard faint distress traffic and pieced together the liner's position and that rescue ships were on the way. His notes spoke of severe trouble long before any official list existed. Yet coastal officers hesitated to say what he already knew. As hours passed, uncertainty turned to dread. Families who believed the first happy lines now read bulletins about lifeboats in freezing water. Shipping companies notified their insurers and prepared statements that said little but hinted at worry. Markets grew tense as shipping stocks swung and marine insurers paused new business. When clearer cables finally arrived, a pattern emerged. No tow ship, no stand-by vessel, lifeboats missing. The scale of the loss came into view not as one announcement, but as a series of possibilities, each worse than the last. The story moved from confusion to consequence, and the world's voice dropped from hopeful to high. The first call reached the Carpathia's radio room after midnight, a mix of CQD and SOS with coordinates and a note about ice. Captain Arthur Rostron did not wait for confirmation. He ordered full speed and turned his ship toward the Grand Banks. He pushed every system past its limit. Steam shifted from heating to engines. Off-duty crew work oiled up, lookouts doubled. The helmsman steered through waters known for icebergs at that time of year. Night air tightened around the decks as the ship ran on. The sea threw floating ice across their path. Engines alsed beyond their rated speed valves, trembling as engineers opened the throttles wide. Rostron put extra lookouts at the bow and wings of the bridge. Rockets and green lights stood ready to signal boats in the dark. The crew rigged cargo nets and ladders and tied heaving lines along the rails where hands would need to grab fast. Preparation spread through the ship. Stewards stripped beds and hauled blankets to the deck. Pantry staff set out turns of coffee, cocoa and soup along the rail. Every few yards a station stood ready with cups. Dining rooms cleared of linen became wards' tables pushed together for bandaging. A purse Aristine set up with sharp pencils to record names boat by boat. The doctor counted dressings and smelling salts, then sent runners for hot water bottles and spare clothes. Dawn came slowly as the first lifeboat slid within reach. Its oars moved, slow and uneven. Lines dropped, hands reached. Survivors came aboard in near silence, faces wind-burned and streaked, with salt clothing stiff from cold spray. Some stumbled, some could not stand. Many kept their eyes on the deck planks, as if looking back might pull them under again. Crew guided them to stations' blankets, first a hot drink, next a place to sit or a stretcher if they could not walk. More boats followed. Names became a list for the purse or S-clerks, each letter spelled out and written twice to catch mistakes. Doctors treated frostbite and shock. Stewards passed spare coats taken from passenger trunks with quiet permission. In corners a few reunions happened almost by accident. People from different boats recognized each other and closed the gap without words. Others searched faces and found nothing, and the understanding settled without ceremony. Rostrum moved from bridge to gangway to saloon, checking every station. Orders kept pace with the flow, more lanterns along the stretchers, forward more hands on the lines. Recognition would come later. For now his decisions compressed hours of work into minutes. Through the morning a single count grew, boat after boat accounted for the number, climbing toward a final tally. In just about 4 hours crew and volunteers brought aboard 705 survivors. A number so large the ship itself felt altered, as if a small town had stepped on board all at once. A wireless room strained under the load, personal messages stacked against official traffic. Operators prioritized names for authorities, casualty lists and signals to ships still searching the area. Storm, static and crowded airwaves made repeats necessary. Meanwhile survivors shared first accounts, still uneven, as the shock began to loosen its grip. By mid-morning Carpathia carried proof the world had not yet seen. On deck and below the news resolved into faces, lists, and empty spaces where names should be. The ship turned west with a weight of information only it could deliver. Rain fell over New York Harbor on April 18th as Carpathia eased past the light ships and moved in under low cloud. She sounded her whistle in short restrained calls. The shoreline answered with a blur of horns and massive umbrellas along the piers. Ferries, idle tugs hovered, people climbed roofs and fire escapes for a line of sight. Harbor pilots guided the ship along a channel thick with small craft, each trying to edge closer. The city waited in a damp hush that broke whenever a mast or funnel showed through the fog. The scale on shore was new, police lines bent and reset as more people pushed toward the water. Mounted officers threaded gaps that closed again as soon as they passed. Reporters crowded near with notebooks and cameras, calling to anyone on deck who looked up. Newsboats shouted through megaphones, but crew at the rails kept their eyes on the lines and ladders. Harbor authorities held back private boats trying to pace the liner. Even with order, the docks felt like a press of questions with nowhere to land. Before anyone stepped ashore, Carpathia made a brief stop at the White Star Pier. Winches rose and swung out, and then the first heavy plane confirmation of loss came over the side. Titanic's lifeboats dented and were set down onto the dock. Men on the pier counted and chalked numbers while photographers aimed at the boat's name. It was the first physical proof many in the city saw. The unloading happened quickly, almost without words, then lines were cast off again for the move to Pier 54. The final approach brought the scene into focus. Ambulances lined the street, and a neat row engines ticking. Doctors and nurses stood ready with stretchers. Inside the shed, families and friends scanned the inner doors, lips moving as they rehearsed names. Journalists held their pencils, waiting for a gate to open. When the ship made fast, a wave of sound rose and then fell, as if the crowd realized noise would not make the list of names longer. On deck, survivors came forward in blankets and borrowed coats, shoes tied with twine, faces marked by cold and lack of sleep. Some looked at the ground, steadying themselves along the gangway. Others searched the mass of faces on the pier and then stopped, unsure where to look next. Crew helped them across the gap into the shed, where cots, benches, and small tables became stations for names, addresses, and destinations. Order competed with disorder. Officials tried to separate medical cases from those fit to walk. Clerks checked spellings and asked for next of kin. Volunteers handed hot coffee, bread, and a change of clothes. Translators moved family to family in several languages. A wall chart began to fill with names. People crowded it so tightly police had to clear lanes every few minutes. The city's main wireless office took over 10,000 telegram requests in one evening, enough to choke the system until public messages were cut off. Relief groups, Red Cross workers, settlement house organizers, church committees offered rooms, rail tickets, and escort. There were reunions that ended in quick embraces and a rush for the exits. There were departures with no one alongside, a quiet step into a hired carriage, or a walk to a waiting car with a blanket kept around the shoulders. By the time the lights inside the shed burned late, it was clear the pair could only meet immediate need. The questions that followed reached past anyone duckened. They were already forming. Outside Pier 50 for the names began to trickle through, but 4 days after, families far from the waterfront lived in a state stretched thin. New York quake each morning to stalled rumors. London early editions contradicted its late ones. In Southampton, where crew families clustered by neighborhood, the quiet, uncertain streets said more than any headline. People tried to read meaning in the absence of updates, counting hours since the last telegram and coming up with nothing they could trust. Crowds formed wherever a sheet of paper might appear. Newspaper bulletin boards drew lines that wrapped around corners. Telegraph offices filled with customers who filled out forms and waited against the wall, watching a clerk's pencil scratch through stacks. Outside shipping company windows, clerks staked fresh lists beside older ones and started to run out of space. Every new sheet drew attention to the gaps, names that should have been their own were not, or names that appeared with a spelling that didn't match a family's memory. Early lists carried errors that multiplied as they moved. Clerks misread hurried handwriting. Operators mistook one surname for another over static and code. Some papers ran composites that blended duplicates and turned to people into one. Households felt the swing a name, and print parked relief a correction in the next edition took it away. In some neighborhoods, neighbors went door to door with folded pages, offering good news that didn't last until nightfall. The human details stood out because they repeated in every city. Parents came with photographs and stood near office doors ready to hold a picture against any list. Spouses wore a path across the same patch of pavement, stepping closer when a new sheet went up, stepping back when the names did not change. Children watched the adults read, then asked the same questions, again trying to learn a pattern in the way the names were added. Telegraph networks buckled under demand. A short cable from New York to a London suburb took hours to clear, even with priority stamps. Operators asked customers to keep messages brief, then told them to wait anyway. Offices posted closing times they could not keep and reopened, with only a fraction of their backlog gone. Private lines for banks and newspapers carried some traffic faster, which meant families sometimes learned about a connection from the next morning's paper before their own cable reached them. Distance did not spare anyone. In Paris and Hamburg, relatives pressed consulates for lists that never seemed to match. In Montreal, Chicago, and San Francisco, wires went out and silence came back. As far as Melbourne and Sydney, names were read on street corners by people who had never seen the Atlantic then debated in living rooms, where clocks were set to a different day. One detail surprised. Even seasoned reporters at the time in several city storefronts became unofficial clearinghouses. Owners tacked survival lists inside their windows and updated them by hand every few minutes as a messenger delivered new slip. People learned the truth in front of a shop that sold umbrellas or boots, then walked home carrying the same item they had come to buy. The ride between hope and loss became mechanical. A penciled name meant a breath, and a eraser felt like a verdict. Community centers, churches and town halls kept their lights on, poured tea and coffee, and set out blankets inside rooms where relatives tried to sleep in coats. When Carpathia's confirmed list finally arrived, the silence in those rooms changed quality. Some stood and left. At once many sat down and did not move. At White Star's New York and London offices, the first hours looked like a battle against gaps. Clerks opened cables that contradicted each other. Managers drafted statements, crossed them out and tried again. The phone boards jammed, so runners carried notes between rooms. Senior staff asked for confirmation that never quite arrived, only fragments that suggested a ship was in trouble and then inexplicably under tow. Press agents leaned on phrases that bought time without admitting defeat. The goal was simple: stabilize the story until something firm appeared. Those first bulletins leaned optimistic. Notices hinted that the liner was afloat and being assisted, that passengers might already be en route elsewhere. The wording sounded careful, but confident enough to calm a morning crowd. When later dispatches showed the gap between hope and fact, those same lines turned into a or point. Readers saw them as proof that the company had chosen reassurance over accuracy, and the criticism stuck. In New York, the office itself became a stage outside. A crowd gathered that grew by the hour, layered with families, reporters, and passers-by pulled in by the noise. Police formed a loose cordon from the windows above, closed survivor names that changed to slowly to satisfy anyone. Inside, staff kept their heads down and their answers short. They had no definitive list, and each update risked doing the last. Executives focused on reputation as much as facts. Telegrams went out with measured language, steering clear of blame or speculation. Employees were told to say nothing beyond official lines. Legal counsel weighed every sentence. The company sought to look informed and in control, even when its own internal notes showed uncertainty. Confusion persisted because information arrived in broken pieces. A handful of survivor lists trickled in, then stalled, then resumed with different spellings and totals. Some were second-hand routed through multiple offices before landing on a desk in New York. Editors demanded names by the minute. The company hesitated for fear of compounding errors, but could not stay silent without appearing indifferent. One detail fueled the mood. At the door, White Star's chairman J. Bruce Ismay was among the rescued. News of his survival reached the city. As Carpathia neared the harbor, he arrived withdrawn and shielded by staff avoiding the press. His presence, while officers and passengers were still unaccounted for, hardened public accusations that leadership had failed in judgment and duty. To blunt anger, the company worked with relief groups. Agreements were made to route survivors directly to medical care, lodging and transport. White Star supplied space, passed along lists and funded immediate needs. These actions served to purpose as real help for people stepping off the ship and a visible answer to critics asking what the company would do next. The communications burden did not ease. Thousands of families sought news at once. Letters, cables, and in-person appeals stacked into piles that no staff could process on schedule. The firm sent form replies where it couldn't, reserved detailed answers for confirmed cases. At the same time, internal discussions turned to compensation. Early offers focused on travel, clothing, and incidental. Broader claims were handled cautiously, framed to limit exposure while expressing sympathy. By nightfall, suspicion had hardened. The distance between public statements and emerging facts invited formal scrutiny. Hearings would not wait. Within days of the sinking, the cable ship Mackay Bennett left Halifax loaded with coffins, ice, and embalming fluid. Its civilian crew briefed for a task none of them had trained for. She steamed toward coordinates passed by rescuers and wireless stations, arriving to a sea still marked by the seas and scattered. I slow foggened the swell that hid and revealed debris with every rise. The crew rigged search patterns and posted extra lookouts. Work boats went over the side in careful pairs and the long methodical sweep began. Conditions worked against them from the start. Icebergs, slow and indifferent, drifted along the lanes. Fog thickened without warning and then thinned, just enough to show shapes that resolved into wreckage. The silence of the site added weight to every movement, and the crew learned quickly how the cold slowed hands and decision-making. Men rotated in and out of boats to keep feeling in their fingers. The captain called for steady pacing, no rushing, no drift, every recovery logged in sequence. The process hardened into a system because it had to. Each body received a number it tagged, an entry in a ledger. A photographer documented distinguishing features and clothing. The purse or esteem opened a canvas bag for effects, then wrote a parallel record. Ring descriptions, watch serials, initials in a color, a folded letter with a return address. If condition and storage allowed, they embalmed and placed the remains in a coffin or wrapped them for cold storage on deck. When space ran short, they made for the most difficult step. Not everyone could be brought back. The crew followed criteria the captain set after consultation with clergy on board. Prioritize those who could be identified, those of better preservation, and those with documents or items that would make identification more likely. Others were sewn in canvas with a weight and committed to the sea, names recorded when possible, notes attached when not. Sailors who had hauled cable for years found themselves pausing at the rail before returning to their station. The choices repeated hour after hour, and they did not get easier. Personal belongings became anchors for families that would later ask how officials' new jewelry went into sealed envelopes with sketches of placement. Wallets were dried and inventoried item by item. Letters were pressed, flattened, labeled with the same number as the ledger entry. Even a scrap of ticket stub found a place in the record. Accuracy mattered because it was the only link left. The scale overwhelmed McKay Bennett within days. Embalming supplies ran out faster than planners expected, and storage space vanished as the count rose. The captain sent urgent wireless messages for more materials, and help relief came as additional recovery ships. Many Amatmunji and Algerie joined the search, each bringing fresh crews, spare coffins, and more fuel. They expanded the grid, recovered more remains, and collected further effects that fed into the same numbering system. Crew later said the work altered how they thought about the scene. Any had years of heavy weather behind them, but they had not seen anything so relentless in its detail. Halifax became the point where that detail met the shore. The majority of recovered victims arrived there for identification, inquests, and burial. Funeral homes and city officials set up temporary facilities. Ledgers met family descriptions across tables, and matches were made with quiet nods and signatures. The search stretched on, but the ocean kept most weeks of sweeping, left wide blanks where names should have been. Families waited for a telegram that never came, and the record closed with more numbers than answers. News of the loss traveled along rail lines and across cables, and the reaction followed it with unusual speed. Major capitals paused their routines, and small towns gathered in meeting halls where someone read out the latest lists. In port cities, flags slipped to half-masted ships, sounded a single note before shutting whistles down. Inland, where the sea was an abstraction, the shock still took hold. People spoke softly on tramways and in markets, checking afternoon editions and then waiting for the evening ones. The feeling was not confined to one country or language. It moved with the same urgency as the headlines. In Southampton, grief did not need an announcement. Whole streets depended on pay packets from crews, and shutters closed on shops that had relied on that traffic. Neighbors kept doors open as messengers brought more names. Schools let children go early in parishes, set extra chairs for families who needed a place to sit together. The absence of footsteps at shift times made the scale plain. Where men had walked to the docks each morning, there was only quiet and the stain of coal dust near the curb. Across cities and towns, memorial services filled churches, synagogues, and community halls. Clergy adjusted schedules to accommodate cycle after cycle of gatherings. Some for named victims, some for the unknown musicians played without program notes, and choirs stayed with familiar hymns so congregations could join without rehearsal. In a rented hall in one district, volunteers set a long table with ink and ledgers so mourners could write down the names they wanted to read. Candles burned down to stubs before anyone thought to replace them. People far from the passenger list still felt a pull. The ship had been introduced to the world as an emblem of modern crafting, its loss cut across distance and class. Office workers set down pens at the same minute each day that weak factory floors paused machines for a stretch of silence. Theaters dimmed house lights between act. Ships that seemed art to the hour with bills and a note to the log. Even with no relatives aboard, many said the event made them think about the thin line between confidence and risk. Telephone exchanges logged a surge they had not prepared for. Operators in several cities reported record-breaking volumes of long-distance calls as people contacted parents, siblings and friends with no purpose other than to say they were thinking of them. Some kept lines open longer than policy allowed, then apologized to the next caller and asked for patience. The wires themselves carried a kind of vigil. Grief took on a local-shaped. Newspapers ran black borders around pages and printed poems sent by readers. Public squares filled without permits as people arrived after work and stayed, not speaking much, just occupying space together. In some quarters, printers sold small remembrance cards with dates and the ship's name and other chalk inscriptions appeared on pavements outside dock gates. Wealthy families organized private services at estates, with a few invited guests and carriages waiting discreetly. Working-class neighborhoods leaned on the open street, or the back room of the pub where collections were started for families with rent due and no wage coming. Underneath the mourning sat a problem no service could settle. Many struggled with the idea that a vessel so admired for its construction could fail so completely in a single night. The language of safety and progress felt thinner. People asked whether rules had kept pace with scale and whether trust in machinery had replaced caution. That question stayed as the flowers wilted and the crowds thinned, and it didn't stop at grief for the dead. It broadened into doubt about the claims that had filled advertisement speeches. The sense of invincibility receded, and with it, the way travelers thought about the ocean. As survivor accounts spread, the public split its attention between gratitude and accusation. People wanted a list of heroes to steady the chaos and a short roster of culprits to carry the blame. Names surfaced with each new testimony, and the story reoriented around actions taken in minutes that decided hours and lives. The search narrowed to questions: who kept working, who yielded space, who waited, and who went first. Chief Wireless Operator Jack Phillips drew early admiration reports, held that he stayed at his set long after hope of power lasting had thinned, sending calls that drew ships toward the coordinate. He became a symbol of duty, the unseen hand behind every answering engine and every searchlight turned on the horizon. Alongside him, other crew and stewards gained quiet recognition from moving people toward boats, repeating instructions, and giving away clothing to those arriving on open decks with little more than evening wear. Accounts also highlighted passengers and officers who took on roles larger than their titles. Some organized lines at boat stations and helped secure slings. Some steadied people down ladders, and some stepped back to make room when space ran short. These stories carried details that resonated: a hand on a shoulder at a rail, a child passed across a gap, a life belt adjusted as the sea climbed. The pattern read as order held together by decisions measured in seconds. Controversy grew alongside the praise. Disputes formed over how boats were and who gave which order, and what instructions led to open seats leaving the ship's side. Testimonies did not always align. One person recalled a strict rule, another remembered confusion and conflicting signal. Bridge decisions on speed and ice reporting drew immediate scrutiny. Questions about drills, boat lists posted or not posted, and access routes through the ship surfaced in hearings and in papers that printed condensed versions for a restless audience. Class sharpened, the debate numbers showed a higher survival rate among first and second class passengers than those in third class. Readers seized on what that implied access to decks, language barriers locked, or crowded passageways, and the advantage of proximity to lifeboat stations. The anger extended beyond arithmetic. It targeted a system that seemed to favor those nearest the railings and the officers' voices. Then came a detail that changed the temperature of the conversation. Some survivors testified that certain lifeboats left with many places empty. The claim landed hard because it's a preventable loss. It moved quickly from rumor to a central point in both public argument and formal investigation. People wanted names attached to each launch, a timeline for each boat, and a reason for every unfilled seat that pulled away into the dark. Attention turned to officers tied to specific boats. Their reputations became storm centers as families and reporters sought clear lines of responsibility. Each decision made in cold and near silence when to lower, whether to return, how many to take, was revisited in the calm of a committee room and judged by people with time to think. The press fed that demand, running large headlines and sharp catches, sometimes flattening uncertainty into certainty to keep interest high. In that noise, acts of courage and claims of failure blurred, stories were retold, misheard, and simplified. Some reputations rose on a single detail, others fell on an error that later proved incorrect. What remained was the hard frame, a crisis that exposed habits, instincts, and the limits of training, and a set of choices that would be argued long after the last headline moved off the front page. News coverage didn't build slowly, it erupted within hours. Presses on both sides of the Atlantic rolled with extra editions, each claiming a new angle, lists of the saved sketches of the ship, timelines assembled from telegraphs that did not agree. Typesetters worked on the fly, swapping out lines between runs as telegraph boys dashed in with slips that altered the narrative mid-page. The pace rewarded speed over certainty, and papers that usually waited for a second source decided that a half-verified detail was better than being lost by an hour. Front pages carried oversized headlines and black borders that signaled morning before readers reached the first paragraph. Columns opened with strong emotional language that framed the disaster as both national and human, a loss to engineering pride and to families now searching for names. Photographs were scarce, so many outlets used engravings or composite images that gave the illusion of presence. The visual package amplified the story at a glance, even when the text underneath still leaned on conjecture. Rivalries between newspapers turned the morning's confusion into an afternoon arms race. Reporters pushed rumors forward because the next city desk would do so if they did not. The competition produced sensational claims and contradictions that made readers doubt the entire cycle. One sheet reported common transfers to rescue ships, the next chaos and lifeboats adrift, later corrections fixed some of the worst errors, but the mix left a residue of uncertainty that outlived the day's editions. On the waterfront, journalists converged on the same square yards of pier, where officials tried to move survivors and cargo through a controlled path. Questions came faster than answers. Reporters leaned over ropes, harbor masters pushed them back. Telegrapher windows became choke points as correspondents begged for precedence on lines already stretched past capacity. Some officers posted signs limiting non-essential traffic, only to face crowds of stringers promising exclusives if given 5 minutes at the key. The public consumed the flood as communal theater bartenders read aloud, while patrons kept count with pencils on coasters. Factory foremen paused the line when a boy arrived with a fresh edition, then let workers pass the paper hand to hand until the ink smudged. At train stations, whole platforms leaned toward a single reader with a strong voice, then broke apart when a rival paper appeared with new totals. One New York daily printed 7 editions in a single day, each correcting and updating headlines from the previous run, a record output that captured the city's appetite for speed. Opinion pages shifted quickly from sympathy to argument. Editorials questioned how money, design choices, and corporate policy intersected with safety. Some asked whether a pursuit of prestige shaped decisions about speed and equipment. Others pressed for standards that would limit discretion at sea. These pieces did not wait for hearings. They built a frame that many readers adopted before officials swore a single witness. Cartoonists reduced complicated failures to stark memorable images, fractured bows, angels over dark altar, lifeboats drawn with wide white spaces where people should have been. Their work fixed themes in the public mind without a line of copy, and those themes returned in speeches and meetings throughout the week. Letters poured into newsrooms, some recounting parallel Mrs. others demanding reforms. Clubs and church basements hosted talks where people debated class, risk, and the reach of modern machines. By the week's end, the press had settled on a simple, forceful thesis. This was an avoidable tragedy. That line became pressure on ministers, regulators, and ship owners, and it tightened as formal inquiries came into view. Public memorial services appeared almost as quickly as the confirmed list. City halls issued permits, churches opened doors, and organizers printed notices for gatherings that filled streets and sanctuaries. In New York, London, Paris, and Montreal, thousands stood through long readings of named short prayers and music chosen to fit the tone of grief rather than ceremony. Processions formed without speeches, the front only a band. A pace drum and a steady route past civic buildings where flags already hung low. Communities with concentrated losses set the scale. Southampton arranged mass processions that moved block by block through neighborhoods connected to the dock, sending at churches that rotated services to handle the flow. Belfast coordinated church ceremonies and factory stoppages, creating a citywide pause that aligned industry with mourning. At noon, bells, shipyards, tram lines, and offices observed minutes of silence that spread across streets as people simply stopped. Those who could not join stood at windows and doorways and kept time with the same intent. Spontaneous memorials took shape around doors where information had been posted. Shipping offices turned into shrines under wreaths and paper bouquets. At ports, the base of bollards filled with wilted flowers, while handwritten notes, some no more than a name and a date, curled under damp. Public squares collected framed photographs and ribbons with ship names inked by hand. The displays grew and thinned on their own cycle, refreshed by morning commuters and evening returners. Permanent tributes began in parallel. Committees commissioned statues that honored specific groups, the ships and engineering crews who kept power running, unnamed deckhands whose tasks never made headlines. Plaques appeared in guild halls and schools, listing hometown victims. Senator Fess rose where no remains could return, giving families a fixed place to visit. Sculptors worked with clear symbolism, angels with outstretched arms, allegorical figures holding torches, and maritime motifs like anchors, ropes, and laurel wreaths to frame loss and service in a language people could read at a glance. Customs shaped mourning. In each district, Christian services followed familiar forms with hymns and lessons. Synagogues hosted memorial prayers that marked community ties across oceans. Other congregations adapted rites to focus on the missing, directing attention to names that could not be placed at graves. Clergy coordinated services, did not compete for space or musicians. The aim was simple access to shared ground. The scale of giving surprised local officials. Funds for memorials spread so widely that over 100 separate initiatives launched within months. City leaders formed committees to sort proposals, prevent duplicate projects, and direct money toward works that could be built and maintained. Meeting notes show careful debates about location, inscriptions, and ongoing upkeep, an early sign that memory would require management as well as sentiment. Symbols carried the message beyond ceremony. Designers favored nautical lines and strong verticals to suggest endurance. Relief carvings of lifeboats appeared alongside verses chosen for restraint rather than drama. Even the choice of stone granite for permanent marble for tenderness signaled intent. Names were arranged by role or street, tying public remembrance to the daily map of each town. Mourning moved into daily routine. Black armbands showed up on tram conductors and shop clerks. Entire blocks observed days of quiet trade. Schools led short reflections at morning assembly for families without a grave. Private griefs at beside public markers, a gap that made Senator Fesson plaques carry extra weight. Those early memorials fixed the event in place, giving later generations a route through the city that led past dates, names, and the plain record of what had been lost. The Senate moved faster than anyone expected within days of the survivors, stepping onto Pier 50 for committees met and voted to open an investigation. That pace was unusual for the era when inquiries often took weeks to organize. Special trains where arranged rooms were secured. Clerks prepared stenography teams and summoned witnesses before ships could sail or memories could scatter across the country. Washington wanted a record, while the details were still fresh and the public was still listening. Senator William Malden Smith stepped to the front of the effort. He pushed for immediate subpoenas and a witness list that ranged from senior officers to stewards, from shipbuilders to wireless operators. His goal was timing and proximity, speak to people before they dispersed, compare accounts while contradictions could still be tested, and build a coherent timeline that matched signals, orders, and the movement of each lifeboat. He kept sessions long and the scope wide, pressing for technical and human factors in the same breath. Hearing rooms filled early each morning. Survivors sat beside crew in borrowed clothes. Journalists lined the walls with pads open, passing notes to runners who carried updates to waiting editors. Members of the public queued for seats, willing to stand for hours to hear testimony delivered without headline filters. The room's sound shifted, with each witness quiet for procedure, tense for cross-checks, and restless when answers strayed into speculation or memory gap. Questioning ran hard at the core issue. Senators asked officers to map lifeboat stations, named real schedules, and explain why boats launched with open seats. Passengers described access routes, language barriers, and who gave directions on the boat deck. Wireless operators talked through signal logs, times, and range limits that had filtered or delayed distress calls. The committee returned often to speed, ice warnings, and the chain of command on the bridge as the night unfolded. The emotional strain surfaced in direct ways. Some witnesses lost their place as they recounted the launch of a particular boat or the moment lights went out. Crew defended split-second decisions made in cold and confusion, pointing to obligations to follow orders and keep people moving. At times, senators voiced disbelief at practices that revealed gaps in regulation: no full-capacity lifeboat plan, no enforced night staffing for radios, and heavy reliance on assumptions about ship design. The pace of documentation was striking. In only a few weeks, the inquiry produced over 1,000 pages of testimony. Stenographers worked in shifts, transcript moved to printers overnight, and bound copies circulated to offices before the next morning's session. Newspapers ran long excerpts, and readers followed the hearings like a courtroom serial, learning new details each day and revising their views in real time. Findings built a clear line of criticism. Lifeboat provision lagged behind. Passenger capacity, safety rules gave too much discretion to individual companies. Confidence in watertight compartments and construction standards had dulled caution about speed and ice. Wireless protocols and coverage were inconsistent, leaving chance to decide which messages got through. White Star officials faced sharp exchanges. They tried to defend policy as standard practice across the industry, but the tone in the room kept pressure on specifics rather than generalities. The inquiry's conclusions pushed beyond one ship or one company. They signaled that maritime safety would be tested in public, with rules expected to reflect the scale of modern liners rather than the habits of an earlier era. Britain moved quickly to mount its own investigation, setting a formal court of inquiry under Lord Mersey. His task was to stage a spectacle. It was to produce an authoritative record that could withstand technical scrutiny. From the outset, officials designed the process to be exhaustive. They gave notice to interested parties, secured documents from shipping companies, and set rules for evidence so the record would hold up across the industry. The hearings in London stretched for weeks and felt very different from the whirlwind in Washington. Proceedings were long, methodical, and focused on technical detail. Naval architects, masters of the North Atlantic Trade and Board of Trade officials unpacked how ships were built, staffed, and regulated. Engineers diagrammed bulkheads and watertight doors. Navigators worked through courses, bearings, and timing. Maritime lawyers kept the room anchored to procedure, turning anecdote into tested fact. More than 90 witnesses took the stand. Senior officers described the watch, helm, orders and lifeboat station. Men from nearby ships were called to explain their positions, signals and responses. Wireless experts explained transmitters, ranges, interference and hydrographic priority. Worked on a busy Atlantic night. Shipbuilders and surveyors traced how design choices met regulations and where those regulations stopped short of real-world hazards. Each thread fed a larger question, not only what went wrong on one ship, but how a whole system allowed it. The court mapped out core issues. Ice messages had flooded the ether that weekend, so officials reconstructed how warnings were logged, routed and acted upon. Speed under ice conditions received close attention down to the minutes between sightings and helm changes. Lookout practices were examined in detail, staffing, training, equipment and whether standard procedures matched the risks of a moonless calm sea. Lifeboat capacity and loading procedures were tested against the passenger lift crew. Strengthened boat drills. The actions of nearby vessels were charted with times, distances and sight lines to understand who could have helped and why help didn't arrive sooner. One striking moment cut through the paperwork. A full-size lifeboat replica was brought into the courtroom so officials could test seating arrangements on lowering gear. They didn't rely on estimates. They counted bodies, measured clearances and discussed how panic, cold and darkness affect simple mechanics. Harland and Wolf-S representatives defended the ship's structure and subdivision, pointing to compliance with the Board of Trade's requirements. Their stance shifted the lens from alleged design weakness to the limits of the law rules that had not kept pace with ship's size, passenger numbers and the realities of wireless navigation. The implication was clear: meeting the letter of existing standards did not equal modern safety. By the end, the court identified a pattern: excessive speed in an ice region. Lookouts with limited tools and no binoculars available at their post, and lifeboat provision far below the number needed combined to raise the death toll. The panel avoided harsh personal blame. Instead, it underscored systemic failures, outdated regulations, uneven enforcement and procedures that favored confidence over caution. Those findings didn't stop at the courtroom, or they pushed maritime authorities towards standardized ice patrols, continuous wireless watches, clear cam, and over lifeboat drills and lifeboat capacity tied to human beings rather than tonnage. The inquiry gave governments a blueprint for reform and signaled to ship owners that the age of voluntary standards had ended. Public anger met official findings head on, and the result was a rapid worldwide rewrite of how ships went to sea. Governments moved from watching the industry to directing it. Laws were drafted, standards were published, and inspectors gained real authority. The goal was simple: no Atlantic crossing would depend on luck, reputation, or company policy ever again. Nations coordinated timelines, so rules came into force quickly, and shipping firms faced audits instead of courtesy visits. The clearest break with the past came with lifeboats. Tonnage tables gave way to head counts. New rules required seats for everyone aboard, passengers and crew, plus margin for emergencies. Ship owners ordered extra boats, divettes and launch gear. Many vessels added double-acting divettes that could serve multiple boats per station to speed lowering. Designers reworked promenade spaces, boat decks and stowage to fit the added craft without blocking escape routes. Engineers also standardized boat numbering, lighting provisions and equipment lists so crews could board and cast off without guesswork. Communication changed from a convenience to a duty. Continuous wireless watches became mandatory, backed by watch schedules, spare parts and power redundancies. Ships had to carry qualified operators with clear authority during emergencies, and distressed traffic took priority at all hours. Shore stations coordinated frequencies, and companies installed better aerials to increase range. Static congestion and missed signals problems that once depended on operator judgment now had procedures that reduced human error. Ice became a shared responsibility. In 1914, major maritime nations created an international patrol to chart berg fields, plot seasonal drift and broadcast daily limits to traffic in the North Atlantic. Navy cutters and later aircraft, surveyed the pack ice and relayed positions to ships through scheduled bulletins. Masters adjusted courses and altitudes of risk according to these notices, treating ice reports as operational directives rather than suggestion. One outcome stood above the rest. The same year saw the first global treaty on sea safety convention that collected these rules into binding international law. It set standards for life-saving appliances, wireless watches, emergency lighting, drills and hull subdivision, and it created a process for updating requirements as technology changed. That framework became the baseline for every revision that followed and still anchors maritime safety law. Training and drills caught up with the equipment. Crews practiced musters, boat handling and station roles on a regular schedule. Passenger briefings appeared on notice boards and in cabin folders. Engineers tested watertight doors, emergency generators and pumps under supervision. Companies issued checklists for abandoned ships, sequences, and captains logged each drill for inspectors. Fire control and collision routines were clarified alongside evacuation steps. Recognizing that multiple failures often arrived together, routes shifted to transatlantic tracks, moved south during heavy ice months, increasing distance but lowering exposure. Lines set seasonal waypoints and updated voyage plans using patrol reports and with a routing date. A master slowed improved visibility near known ice limits and posted extra lookout. Bridge teams dimmed lights, adjusted watertight door policies, and maintained tighter helm records in risk zones, embedding caution into daily practice. Passengers changed the market. Fare buyers asked about lifeboat counts, drill policies, wireless coverage, and medical staff. Brochures began listing safety features beside dining rooms and smoking lounges. Luxury sold only when paired with clear safeguards, and companies learned that trust depended on proof. From equipment to training, from routes to law, the lessons hardened into rules that had lived the headlines and kept working every time a ship cleared the harbor. Stepping off the rescue ship didn't end the ordeal. Survivors walked into a new kind of struggle, sleeplessness, sudden anger, and gaps in memory that made ordinary routines feel unfamiliar. Some went days without work because they couldn't face crowds or noise. Others traded sea legs for clinic benches, answering questions about appetite, headaches, and nerves that doctors didn't have names for yet. Families tried to help with extra meals and spare rooms, but the quiet at night brought the worst moments back with unnerving clarity. Long before anyone used the term PTSD, the symptoms were there. People described waking drenched in sweat after reliving whistles, cries, and the tilt of a deck that wouldn't stop moving in their minds. Survivors' guilt set simple tasks on edge: getting dressed, hearing a kettle boil, standing near running water. Many avoided harbors entirely. Some changed routes through their own neighborhoods to dodge river bridges or ferry terminals. A few found relief in strict routines, evening walks at the same hour, journals that tracked bad nights, and work schedules that left no idle time for memory to return. Working-class survivors faced a sharper edge. Crew and immigrants lost tools, uniforms, documents, and savings with the ship. Wages stopped when the voyage ended, and the sudden need for new clothing, lodging, and identification drained what little they had left. Employers were wary of hiring sailors who flinched at alarms. Stewards and firemen ride rail factory jobs, but irregular hours and loud machinery stirred flashbacks. Immigrant families who had counted on quick entry into new jobs had to start from nothing, filing papers for lost trunks and pleading for emergency relief while learning unfamiliar city system. Wealthier survivors carried different burdens. Their names appeared in columns and hearings. Unsocial circles grew tense. Dinner invitations came with unspoken tests: who had stepped into a boat early, who had argued at a davit, who had stood back. Even those cleared by official accounts felt watched. Some kept to country houses for months, avoiding clubs and hotels where questions lingered. Philanthropy became a form of repair, donations to relief funds, hospitals, and seafarers' homes, meant to reset reputations as much as to help. Not everyone spoke. Some survivors gave lectures and pushed forward rules and wireless rules. Others refused interviews entirely. Silence acted like armor. Names changed on business cards, families moved across cities or oceans to leave the event behind. Still, a few became symbols for endurance in a way they never asked to be. One woman survived the Titanic, the sinking of the hospital ship Britannic, and a separate collision at sea, and newspapers started calling her the unsinkable, a label that drew crowds whenever she traveled or worked. Children carried the longest shadows. Many grew up wary of sleep, afraid of loud bangs, or fixated on escape routes in theaters and schools. Careers followed the imprint: nursing, engineering, safety inspection, or in some cases maritime work taken on as a way to master the fear. Siblings who shared a lifeboat tended to stay close for life, and they formed habits that lasted: packed bags by the door, savings tucked where they could be grabbed in a hurry. Survivors met again at memorial services, anniversaries. They wrote small newsletters, traded addresses, and formed support that looked like extended family. A few published memoirs decades later, after details studied with time, while others left quiet notes for their children that explained why seas and sirens still made them freeze. Their accounts did more than fill archives. They shaped how the public understood risk, duty, and chance on a cold ocean night, and they kept the human scale of the disaster within reach for those who would never see the North Atlantic. News of the sinking didn't just stun families, it rattled balance sheets across the North Atlantic trade. Steamship firms, brokers, and port agents paused schedules and reviewed exposure. Freight books then the shippers held cargo for confirmation of new safety rules. Charter rates wobbled. Some captains delayed departures to gather fresh ice reports, burning coal without earning fares. Banks that financed ship mortgages asked for updated valuations, since a single loss could erase years of profit on a route that relied on tight margins and predictable timetables. For the White Star Line, the ledger turned red in layers. The ship's value vanished with the hull, but the losses didn't stop there. Cargo manifests included fine goods bound for department stores, machinery, parts tied to delivery contracts, and perishables that couldn't be replaced quickly. Mail revenue, a steady stream tied to government agreements, stopped at once, and penalties for non-performance followed. Legal costs grew by the week as claims arrived from families, cargo owners, and crew representatives. Insurance offsets helped, but deductibles, legal defense, and reputational damage kept cash flowing out faster than it came in. Commerce felt the break in more places than the docks. Merchants who expected spring inventory faced empty shelves and paid premiums to replace stock on short notice. Factory orders stalled when components on Titanic failed to arrive, forcing overtime late to catch up. The absence of immigrants had its own economic ripples. Employers in American and Canadian cities had counted on new labor to fill mills, track gangs, and kitchens. When hundreds never appeared, foremen delayed projects or paid higher rates to draw workers from other towns. Insurers moved from routine risk to triage. Underwriters had spread policies across whole machinery, cargo, and liability. But the scale of one loss across all lines strained reserves. Premiums for large liners rose, and clauses around ice navigation, wireless watches, and lifeboat equipment tightened. Surveyors demanded more documentation before renewal. Reinsurers recalculated exposure to fleets with multiple big ships, wary of correlated losses when firms built vessels to similar designs and ran them on the same routes in the same season. Investors watched shipping shares swing as the market questioned the economics of superliners. These ships delivered prestige and high-ticket cabins, yet they required heavy capital, deep coal bunkers, and large cruise yards. Building sister ships faced uncomfortable questions from boards about delivery schedules and design revisions, since a delay meant interest costs without early revenue. Companies already thin on cash postponed refurbishments on older vessels to conserve funds for safety retrofits on flagships. Amid the uncertainty, one detail stood out: trading at Lloyd's of London paused when the first wave of reports hit, because underwriters called and priced the total exposure until facts settled. That rare halt signaled how far the financial shock had spread beyond any single firm. Meanwhile, immigrant communities bore costs that no policy covered. Families who had sold property for tickets lost not only relatives but their savings plans. Relief funds helped with rent and food, yet plans for remittances and small shop openings evaporated. Compliance carried a new price tag. Companies bought extra lifeboats and vets, upgraded wireless rooms, hired more operators, and added watch standards. They rearranged deck space, cut into promenades, and sent ships 2 yards for fittings that sidelined them for earning voyages. Brochures changed to safety equipment, drill policies, and medical staffing took space once reserved for dining room lists. Bookings returned only when passengers saw proof rather than promises. Over time, accountants learned a hard lesson: a single night at sea could impose costs that echoed through contract premiums and share prices for years. And it forced an industry to accept regulation as part of staying solvent. The calamity moved from the front page to the stage faster than most events of the era. Within weeks, artists and writers treated the sinking as shared material, not distant news. Street printers sold broadsides with crude woodcuts, periodicals ran elegies next to tide charts, editors assigned serialized memoirs from survivors, each installment drawing letters from readers who felt they now knew the voices behind the name. Art schools scheduled quick exhibitions of sketches and watercolors that tried to make sense of a ship meeting ice on a still night, and publishers rushed slim volumes that blended reportage with moral commentary. Newspapers and magazines did more than report. They curated a common language for grief, illustrators repeated motif, stilted decks, rockets rising into a starfield of lifeboats, stern lamp fading into dark water. Poets filled Sunday supplements with stanzas about duty, hubris, and farewell, while staff writers shaped survivor accounts into weekly narratives that let audiences follow a person, not a passenger list. These stories gave the public a timeline and, just as important characters to remember, they also set expectations for what really happened before investigators settled the record. The theater picked up that script immediately. Managers booked dramatizations that promised first-hand details and exact deck plans. Some productions focused on restraint, hush scenes of orders passed down, the hum of a wireless set the rhythm of oars on a cold sea. Others leaned into spectacle with pumped stilting platforms and painted ice backdrops that cracked under footlights. Audiences came to compare accounts and to weigh bravery against rumor. Touring companies carried these versions from big cities to small halls, so the same night could feel like both a civic lesson and entertainment. Film producers moved even faster. Silent shorts and features appeared in 1912 using miniatures, staged acts, and intertitles to walk viewers through collisions. Calls for help and departure scenes reconstructed from memory. One early release cast a real survivor as its led only weeks after the disaster, turning lived experience into performance and drawing crowds who wanted proximity to the event itself. The medium's speed and its reach across language barriers made the story global in a way theater could not match. Music halls and churches found common ground in memorial songs, ballads named ships, bands, and captains, then resolved into refrains fit for public singing. Hymn arrangements reached congregations that rarely read the foreign news but recognized loss and duty. Sheet music sold briskly. Teachers used it for lessons that doubled as remembrance. Street pianos and parlor organs turned private rooms into small services as families worked through grief by repeating familiar lines. Images of lifeboats, bergs, and a giant hull became shorthand that advertisers and cartoonists reworked for their own messages. Shipping companies touted safety in new posters, while political artists bent the ship's outline into critiques about regulation, wealth, and modern confidence. Postcards, cigarette cards, and magazine covers fixed the iconography so firmly that later generations recognized the story by silhouette alone. These devices traveled easily through the mail, multiplying the narrative in ordinary drawers and showboxes. Early portrayals also set patterns that stuck. Heroism and sacrifice took center stage, while class boundaries and locked gates gained symbolic weight whether or not details matched official finding. Sermon school recitations and club lectures folded those themes into moral lessons about prudence and responsibility. When historians later corrected errors, the popular version kept its footing, because people had already rehearsed it aloud, sung it, and acted it. That persistence ensured the sinking stayed in public culture, not as a distant date, but as a living reference point that artists and audiences returned to whenever they needed to speak about risk, progress, and the cost of being wrong at sea. As the first reports traveled across cables and front pages, the story began to pick up debris, rumors, guesses, and oversimplified explanation. Early coverage needed certainty before investigators could provide it, so headlines and illustrations filled the gaps. Those gaps hardened into beliefs that stuck to the disaster for decades. People repeated what sounded reasonable, what felt satisfying, and what matched the moral tone of the moment. With a wreck out of reach, the world turned memories into maps and treated them like coordinates. Take the word unsinkable. Before the voyage, some brochures and trade journals used careful language about watertight compartments in modern construction. After the loss, the word lost all its qualifiers. Newspapers and public speeches gave it capital letters and moral weight, turning a marketing boast into a claim of absolute safety. The phrase worked because it seemed to capture the early 20th century confidence in technology. It also provided an easy lesson: pride met ice and pride lost. That clarity made the label hard to dislodge, even when inquiries and engineers spoke in measured terms. For many years, people believed the ship went down in one piece. Eyewitnesses watched from darkness in cold wind at great distance and described what they thought they saw. Without physical evidence, officials leaned on that testimony. The single hull idea fit expectations about how a liner would fail, and it avoided imagining a breakup that suggested deeper structural questions. Later analysis would challenge that picture, but for a generation, the one-piece narrative held. Another durable story claimed that third-class passengers were kept back by locked gates. Survival rates did differ sharply by class, and that fact demanded an explanation. Locked doors were a simple one. Inquiries produced a more complicated picture: language barriers, confusing routes, delayed instructions, and fewer stewards per passenger. Below decks all slowed movement. Lifeboat stations, untraining skewed toward first and second class spaces, and access points were not equally visible. The result looked like deliberate confinement, even when the real causes were disorder and design. Other tales spread because they fit a dramatic arc. People repeated accounts of crewing ignoring ice warnings or passengers waltzing as the bow went under. These details made good theatre and quick copy, but evidence for such scenes was thin or second-hand. The same goes for the soundtrack of the final minutes. The idea that the band played Nearer My God to Thee became so fixed in culture that some survivors later admitted they could not say what the musicians played. Distance and noise overwhelmed the ear. Misreported heroism and villainy attached to names. A calm order given in one account became a shouted command in another. A disputed moment at a davit defined a person's legacy more than years of service. Early films and stage shows turned those sketches into characters with motives and arcs, and audiences accepted the portrayals as truth when they echoed the headlines. Newsrooms favored clear narratives, and fictional retellings borrowed them wholesale, blending fact and performance until they were hard to tell apart. These myths endured because the seabed kept its secrets. With no wreck to study, memory was the only archive most people could reach. That would change when expeditions finally went back to the coordinates and brought hard evidence to the surface of the debate. From the night Titanic slipped under, people talked about going back. Engineers, naval officers, and fortune seekers sketched ideas on napkins and in journals. But the tools of 1912 could not touch a wreck resting beyond daylight and diver limits. Still, the thought persisted: the ship was out there intact or broken, waiting for someone with the right method and enough money to try. The first proposals were more enthusiasm than engineering. A few inventors argued for giant balloons to lift the hull as if buoyancy could ignore pressure to miles down. Others drew schemes using powerful electromagnets for getting seawater corrodes. Siltberry steel and magnets weaken with distance. There were plans to encase the wreck in frozen nitrogen to harden and raise. Is end a famous suggestion to pump the interior full of ping-pong balls, counting on their collective lift to overcome weight and drag. These ideas captured headlines because they were vivid, not because they solved the physics. Real progress arrived when oceanography stepped forward. By mid-century, navies and research institutes were testing echo sounders, side scans, and narrow-day-operated cameras. The search became a technical problem. Convert a vast patch of North Atlantic into strips of surveyed seafloor, then investigate anomalies one by one. Scientists mapped temperature, layers, currents, and sediment, learning how metal scatters, sound, and how debris fields spread when a ship breaks apart. Expeditions in the 1950 seconds through the 1970 seconds tried to narrow the target box. Crews towed fish-shaped sonar bodies behind ships, painting grainy images on rolling paper. They plotted returns by hand and cross-checked with current charts the depth, nearly 2.5 miles, meant narrows, with propulsion slow speeds to keep gear stable. Days of work could only cover a few square miles, and full stargates wasted precious sea time. When storms hit, the gear came up and the clock burned fuel and funds. The obstacles were stubborn. The reported sinking coordinates were estimates taken in crisis, and currents could push lifeboats and wreckage far from the site, throwing off back calculations. The seabed in that region, innocent and flat, it's a rough landscape with ridges and gullies that hide shapes and confuse sonar shadow. Any search pattern had to account for navigation, drift, magnetic variation, and the simple difficulty of holding a straight line over long hours in open water. One Cold War expedition carried a secret of its own. A high-profile hunt for Titanic doubled as cover for locating lost U.S. nuclear submarines, folding the famous liner into a military mission. The public story focused on history and discovery. The real brief included classified objective, showing how the wreck's legend could shield entirely different stakes. Motivation ran onto tracks. Emotionally, people wanted a place to point their grief and away, to test long-argued claims about lifeboats' breakup and final moments. Scientifically, researchers wanted data of fracture patterns, corrosion rates, and sedimentation that could rewrite textbooks on deep-sea decay and inform safety design. Television specials, magazine spreads, and emerging deep-sea tech kept audiences engaged. Remotely operated vehicles, better sonar arrays, and satellite navigation promised cleaner images and tighter search boxes. Private ventures joined universities, sometimes to preserve history, sometimes chasing salvage rights and exhibition revenue, that raised hard questions about ownership, law, and the ethics of disturbing a maritime grave. After years of empty grids, false leads, the sense grew that success required a rare blend: precise instruments, patient mapping, reliable funding, and a team willing to stay at sea until the instruments told a story no rumor could match. September 1985, the search grid tightened, and a joint American-French team, led by oceanographer Robert Ballard, finally saw what decades of charts and theories had missed. A camera system towed just above the seabed sent up a stream of grey images. Then, in the wash of silter shape, came into focus a massive boiler lying alone on the mud. Moments later, plates, rivets, and twisted beams appeared. The debris rail confirmed they were on target. After years of failed passes, the wreck of Titanic had been found. The technology made the breakthrough possible. Instead of divers, the team used deep-sea imaging gear designed to operate nearly 2.5 miles down, where pressure crushes anything not purpose-built. Towed cameras skimmed the bottom using altitude sensors to hold a constant height above the terrain. Remote-operated instruments logged coordinates, headings, and temperature layers, so each return could be mapped precisely. Side-looking sonar helped trace patterns in the seabed that pointed to heavy objects, while forward-looking video kept the 2W fish from plowing into ridges or cables left by earlier trolls. On decks, islands gave way to quick-clipped voices as the feed showed scattered artifacts. A furnace door with its hinges, visible crockery, half buried in ripples of sand, a section of hull with portholes punched into it by time and pressure. The mood shifted from doubt to confirmation. Crew members had trained themselves to distrust first impressions, but piece after piece fit the profile of a large linet or an open end dropped into darkness. The images did not shout, they accumulated, until there was no other explanation. Then came the surprise that read through the accepted story. The debris trail led to two major structures separated by a wide stretch of seafloor. The ship had broken apart before reaching the bottom. That single fact contradicted long circulating accounts that showed Titanic going down in one piece. Split off with new questions about stresses, flooding sequences, and how the hull failed under changing loads. It also explained the broad debris field. When a hull divides, pieces scatter far beyond a neat outline. One mind-bending details behind the expedition itself. The same crews that found Titanic also served a classified U.S. Navy objective to locate the lost nuclear submarine. The historical research went forward only after the military work was complete, tying a famous shipwreck to Cold War priorities hidden from public view at the time. As the cameras ranged wider, the scale became clear. The bow section rose from the bottom. Like a collapsed building, the stern lame angled, a sign of water rushing through decks that could not hold shape in freefall. Between them the field stretched with personal items, used still paired stacks of plates fused by sediment trunks and luggage frame. Researchers spoke carefully about what to touch and what to leave undisturbed. The material was fragile and the site carried weight as a place where lives had ended. News of the discovery moved fast and interest surged again. Documentaries, secured footage, publishers commissioned new studies that used the debris map to test old claims. Scientists modeled corrosion rates at depth and tracked how bacteria consume iron, changing the wreck. Each year a debate sharpened over whether to retrieve artifacts or treat the area strictly as a grave. Ballard argued for leaving the site intact and using images, surveys and virtual models to learn without taking. The find did not close the file, it opened a phase where evidence replaced speculation in the story, expanded from loss to long-term stewardship of what lay on the seabed. The impact of the sinking did not fade with the headlines. It carved a permanent place in how nations regulate oceans, how engineers design complex systems, and how museums, classrooms, and living rooms talk about risk. Lawmakers built standards that outlasted governments, and the cultural memory kept the event present long after the last eyewitness passed away. The disaster sits at the intersection of technology and society, a reference point used whenever progress outruns safeguards and the costs become visible. Over time, the story turned into a shorthand for ambition and vulnerability. People use the ship when they explain why checklists matter, why redundancy beats bravado, and why confidence needs limits. Artists return to the theme because it holds a universal tension, bold design, meeting a real environment that does not negotiate. Scientists study it because the record ties decisions to outcomes with unusual clarity. That combination, scale, documentation and consequence lets the event speak across languages and professions. In universities and academies, the case appears in ethics courses, marine architecture, human factors, and leadership seminars. Instructors break down design assumptions, decision chains from abridging the pressures that shape choices under time constraints. Students track how small oversights compound and how organizations normalize risk until an accident exposes the pattern. Naval programs fold the lessons into bridge resource management and emergency command, while business schools examine communication failures, incentives, and false comfort of reputation. The wreck also pushed exploration forward. Curiosity about its condition and layout helped justify investments in deep-rated cameras, remote autonomous systems that could map terrain at extreme depth. Ocean mapping techniques refined over the site, mosaics, photogrammetry, and high resolutions, and now guide research on trenches, ecosystems, and other wrecks. Engineers learned how materials behave under pressure and how microbes consume iron at depth, knowledge that feeds into design and long-term preservation plans. Public interest cycles. Every few decades, new books revisit the archived documentaries, add recovered footage, and updated models. Exhibitions travel from city to city, and films pull new audiences into the timeline. Artifact tours have drawn more than 30 million visitors worldwide, a number that puts these shows among the most attended historical exhibitions of the modern era. That scale explains why the story stays available. Organizers can fund careful conservation, and institutions can teach context alongside display. Law kept pace and in some areas still follows the wake of 1912 international safety rules. Iceberg monitoring, distress protocols, and crew training standards trace their lines to the reforms sparked by the loss. Committees revise requirements as technology changes, but the core aims: life-saving equipment for all, reliable communication, and practiced evacuation remain direct answers to failures exposed on that April night. Maritime agencies coordinate across borders, so ships receive the same warnings and follow compatible procedures. Families carried the memory forward on a smaller scale. Descendants run local museums, read letters at community events, donate artifacts, and record oral histories that are detail missing from official files. Those personal efforts keep names connected to real lives rather than lists, and they anchor the lesson in daily language. Today, people use the ship as a metaphor. Politicians, engineers, managers, and commentators reach for it when they talk about preventable loss, corporate hubris, or resilience under pressure. The word signals a caution without needing a diagram. As the series draws to a close, the ship's as a warning catalyst and an open invitation to keep asking how we build, how we decide, and why the sea still holds our attention. Titanic continues to captivate the world, reminding us how one tragic night reshaped history, technology, and our understanding of human resilience. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure you subscribe so you never miss our next exploration into the past. And so this chapter of history slowly fades into the quiet flow of time. Some mysteries remain unanswered, and some truths continue to shape our world. We have walked through the past together and learned what it can teach us. If you carry this knowledge forward with you through each day, then the echoes of history will never be lost. Thank you for listening, and until next time, let the past remain alive in your mind.